Hello, welcome to video number 6 in our series, Microsoft Certified Professional Developer 4.0 with ASP.NET and C#. The exam focus is 70-515, and this content is owned and created by Ravi Nanganuri, Microsoft MVP, .NET So video number 6, we're going to explore validating user input or validation. Validation is basically applying rules to the data you collect. So when you're using ASP.NET Web Forms, you're most likely going to be collecting some type of data from a user. How do we validate that data? Make sure that that data is good. We don't want to put bad data in the database, for example. We want to require certain fields get filled out on forms, this type of thing. And we have a couple different options for doing validation in ASP.NET, client-side versus server-side. So is the validation going to happen on the browser via like JavaScript, or is it going to happen on the server side? By far, the client-side stuff is much easier to tamper with. It's less secure. It's going to provide a niftier, more nice user experience than having to go to the server and validate everything. So it can provide a much more snappy and best user experience, but it doesn't provide us the security we really need. So the best approach is to use both. To use client-side validation, and then to make the user experience good, and then to do the validation on the server side as well. And this is kind of done by default for us with ASP.NET. There are various ASP.NET validation controls. We're going to look at a few of these. Many times we want to simply require fields. If I'm going to take data from a customer, I'm obviously going to want their name, their address, this type of stuff. We'll look at a basic example with like a login form. Compare validators. So maybe I want to take one control, compare it to another, like two password text boxes. I want to make sure those controls match exactly. And then with regular expressions, let's make sure we get a valid zip code or something that's kind of you want to use a regular expression with. It's very popular with other programming stuff. You can use that with the validation controls as well. Now we can use validation groups. Let's say we had more than one button on a form and they're causing validation, but we only want to validate certain controls for certain buttons and do this type of stuff. With ASP.NET now, what we can do is use validation groups and kind of group the controls together. We'll look at an example of that. So there are some various techniques and best practices. Again, you're going to want to rely on the server-side stuff for security. The client-side stuff is going to provide a better user experience. What about initial value, like text boxes that have initial value in them, but you want to make sure that gets changed? Some of these techniques we'll kind of look at as we move throughout the video here. We've got a very simple web form up here. All this is one web form. It's called login.aspx. There are a few controls here. And once you learn how to use validation with these controls, you can pretty much do validation with anything. I should point out you could also, any of the controls that you don't see built in here just by default, you can create your own. That's possible. We could also use what's called a custom validator, do some custom validation code. That's going to be on kind of the scope of what we're looking at for the video and the certification as well. I've got some, just by dragging and dropping this required field validator onto a form, it's going to drag and drop. I want to give this a nifty name here that basically points to the control itself that we want to validate. It's very common to want to just have fields be required. If somebody's filling out a web form here, obviously password is going to be required, so it would be user ID. So you're probably going to have more than one required field validator. We're going to keep this very simple. At this point, we're going to go down here to I'm going to change the error message property to the user ID is required. So I'm wanting to validate that they enter something in for the user ID. And you noticed here I'm going to give this a descriptive ID so I understand which validator goes to which. You'll notice as you build your forms out here, good descriptive names on your validation controls make sense because you're going to probably be using a combination and more than one of them. At this point, I've got the required field validator, which I dropped into form. You see it kind of stuck it over near the confirm password. We'll fix that up in a minute. And these various controls that are on the form are, for example, the text box here. It was going to have something called causes validation down here. So the idea is usually your button, that's false by default on your text boxes. It's the button click themselves that's going to cause validation by default equal to true. If I click on the validation control itself, there's a few interesting properties here as well. One is enabled client script. This is saying, hey, if you support JavaScript, we certainly want to do the client-side validation to make the user experience better. So enable that. And it'll also do the validation on the server side. So if we look at this form, if I just went and ran it right now as is, all I've done is drag and drop a user ID required field validator pointing to that user ID. And you say, hey, it says user ID is required here. Notice it's putting it down here by the password. That's no good. We're going to fix up the kind of the view and the design here in a moment. The button click itself is what causes the validation, and the page.isValid is being checked for true or false based on what we wired up here. So if I go ahead and kind of move some things around here, you're going to probably place your required field validators. The best practice is going to be to place those near the controls that you're validating. It makes things easier. But as we'll see, we can use this validation summary control down here to kind of summarize the error messages. This can get really messy on your screen if you've got large forms, and you're going to want to use the summary control to kind of consolidate and put all these error messages in one place, and then maybe just like flag the text box with an asterisk or something like that. So the way that we do this is, you notice that we have the button here, and I'll go ahead and make another BR tag here to kind of clean this up, and I'm using split view here to kind of lay this out. Now down near the login button below that, I've got my validation control here. So no matter which of these text boxes I'm validating, which you can imagine I'm going to have a required field for all three of those, I could just summarize what didn't get entered or what wasn't valid all in that one spot. At this point, I am going to go ahead and move this required field validator up near the text box that it's actually validating, which was user ID in this point. And I can change the actual text from user ID to just like an asterisk now. I've got an error message saying that user ID is required. Once I also implement a text property here, we'll go ahead and just run this to kind of demonstrate. So creating this validation, I hit login. You see user ID is required. It's now at the bottom and the top though, and I don't want that as well. I've got the summary control. That looks a lot better down there. Of course, it's still telling me user ID is required in two places, and typically you're not going to want that. Once you introduce the text property here and just introduce something like an asterisk or no text at all even, what you can do is the error message itself, that's what will be displayed down in the validation summary part, which is typically what you want, and you just have this little asterisk next to the text box that we're doing the validation for. And I'll just clean this up a bit further, and you notice this is going to look a lot better, a lot different now, more realistic than how you want. I'll go ahead and rerun this. I'll click login. It's saying, hey, user ID is required on the bottom, but it's just flagging with a little asterisk. We're not duplicating that text anywhere. We're going to keep the form nice and neater. And again, the power of the validation summary control is you can imagine a form with lots of different text boxes and such. We're not going to want all of that stuff being spit all over the screen as far as the error messages. We put them all in one place, again, with the summary control. So you've got your enable client script, which you can turn this on and off. I'm going to turn this off real quick just to show you, again, what that means. So if I'm saying don't do client-side validation, when I click the login button, you'll notice down there that page is posting back now. It's causing a post back before I actually see the user ID is required. Now, it's very fast for this web form. There's not a lot going on, but you can imagine the user experience being affected. And just like you'll use JavaScript to make the user experience better for other reasons, same thing with this particular validation. So enable client script is on just by default, and you're probably going to want to take advantage of that. If users had turned off JavaScript and all that in their browser specifically, we would still done the validation on the server side. So again, kind of the plumbing of all that's handled for you at this point. Okay, so as I kind of begin to roll out what we're doing here, you notice I've got the client script stuff turned on. If you went down and you actually looked at the source for your web form under like page view source down here in the browser, you could actually see the JavaScript getting created that does this required field validation. So this JavaScript's getting sent down to the browser, and if the browser is going to support that, it's going to be enabled and all of that. We're going to basically say, hey, we'll do the validation on the client side before we post a page via a post back. This way you don't fill out all these fields in a web form, click post, have to sit and wait, etc. So if we look at the various controls that are here, at this point we've used the validation summary, we used the required field validator, there's various other ones here. Let's drag and drop the compare validator. Very common, maybe you want to compare two form fields, make sure they're matches, make sure there's some type of comparison going on here. So once again, I just drag and drop this on the page. I could have created this programmatically as well in the HTML. I'm just going to give a passwords must match. This is very common, of course, entering password then confirm password. Show you how easy it is to wire this up. There's basically two properties. And again, the text property, I just know going in, I'll enter the asterisk. I don't want that text being duplicated both places. And then automatically that summary control is just going to be able to pick that up. Now, which control I want to validate? I'm going to say I want to control validate text box 2, which is my password text box there. I should name that more appropriately. And then confirm password text box is text box 3. So if we go back and look at the properties, the compare validation control, which is a common control to use, has a control to compare and a control to validate. It really wouldn't matter which one I went here, text box 2 or text box 3, if I flip-flop these. The idea is I'm taking one control, I'm comparing that to the other control. So if I just ran this as is right now, and we would simply enter in a user ID, and then I enter in like 1, 2, 3 for the password. Notice when I tab out, the JavaScript kicks in. It's saying, hey, that confirm is going to have to match exactly. So if I was to just try to post this at this point, it's going to say passwords must be exact match. So we're taking one control and simply comparing that to another control. So it's very straightforward, very simple to use. And then once again, we're getting the benefits of the validation summary control. And you notice that my form's starting to look a lot better now, keeping it a lot more tidy, again, by leveraging the summary control and by leveraging the text property of the validation control itself. I'm going to go ahead and build out the story a bit further. I'm going to drag and drop another button. Imagine a form when we've got more than one button. That's going to be fairly common, or something that's going to cause validation. For this example, I'm going to use a button, and I'm going to call this register user. So with validation groups that we mentioned in the beginning of the video, what we can do is say, by default, all of these buttons are going to want to validate everything on the form. So that may not be the effect you want. So for example, I've got two buttons now, a register user and a login form. If I click register user, all this stuff, the validation controls that I wired up previously, they're going to cause validation. The button's going to cause validation. Everything's going to be checked. Imagine if I had a more robust form where I actually had first name, last name, address. I wouldn't need all of that filled out every time when somebody clicked login. But I would want that if somebody clicked register user. So what you can do is use validation groups here, and I will go ahead and just let's try to build out the form a little bit further. I'll basically just copy paste. I'm going to create a field called name here. So imagine the scenario is we are on a form where they can either click register user or log in, depending if they already have an account. And depending which button they click, we're going to validate only certain parts of the screen or the form. So we can use validation groups to accomplish this in ASP.NET. So I've got user ID, name, password, confirm password. At this point, again, no matter what we do, the register user and login button are going to cause validation everywhere. We're not using any validation groups at this point. So if I threw in a required field validator for the actual name field, and then I clicked login, it's actually going to cause validation on that name. And then everywhere else there's validation for required fields, and at this point I just have user ID with the required field. So the properties are the same here. This button, maybe I don't want it to cause validation. I could certainly set that to false, but by default all buttons that you drag and drop there are just going to have this on. So if I click register user, it says, hey, okay, fire required field, the user ID. So it makes sense at this point. I click name. We don't have a required field validator yet for name, so we're going to go ahead and stick one in at this point. So you can see that we talked earlier about as you start to build out their validation story, if you're going to use the validation controls, keeping these validation controls along next to the controls you're validating makes sense. You're going to have a combination of validation controls at this point. So all I've done is added another required field validator. It says user ID is required, name is required. So now we have basically the more robust story here. What I'd like to happen is when I click register user, I want to be able to validate user ID is entered. I also want to make sure that they entered a name here at that point. And when I click register user, that's what I want to have work what's valid. So that's working at this point. But the problem is when they click login, what I want to see is only certain validation controls fire. I don't care if they enter a name when they click login, for example. So the validation group that I keep mentioning, it's not in the validation controls area. You're not going to be able to drag and drop that on the form. It's simply a property that's going to be both on the button itself as well as the validator control, the validation summary control. So if I come to the button, and this is the register user button, I can simply go ahead and I'll get the IntelliSense, and I've got this validation group property. And I'll set this to register user. And then now what I can do is go to the various required field validators and set that same property, that same text. So you can just come out here to this particular required field validator, which is, of course, the name is required. I'll give this validation group equal register user, and that's all it is. And at this point, I've wired up the actual required field validator down to the button itself that's causing the validation. I'm saying, hey, only validate, basically, where you see this validation group. And I've also put it down in the validation summary control as well. So when I go ahead and rerun this at this point, and somebody types in register user, it's saying, hey, the name is required. We expect that. We're going to have to do a, we'd have to wire up user ID as well if we wanted it that way, but it's only now. The login is only validating user ID. The login is no longer validating name, as you see, and the register user is only validating name and not user ID, so vice versa here. So you can group these logically as it makes sense if you need this type of functionality. Don't get kind of lost in the example. The idea is you can use validation groups so that each of your buttons, once again, only validates certain parts of your screen or certain controls on your screen. So, a nifty, handy feature. I would need another validation summary control here at this point. So as you see, the controls, you can start to build out several controls and combination of controls to do real robust validation. This is a simple username and password screen, and already we have several validation controls in play. But I've not written a bit of code at this point. This has all been done declaratively. I've basically drag and drop my controls. There's not really been any code in the code behind involved, albeit we could have custom validation happening. Everything's happened in the HTML, and very simple and really easy to kind of wire things up. I want to show initial value as well. So it's often, imagine we have a required field validator, but we have this initial value that we have on a text box. Like maybe I want to have this text box that says name here, say enter first name. So I'll come over to the text box that is for name, and I will enter in the text property here, and it will simply say enter first name at this point. And by setting that initial value property to the same thing here that's in the text property for the text box, it knows that when that must be changed, that field is still going to be required, so that we're going to have to change that. So to see this in action, I'll go ahead and just rerun this form. And you'll see here that it says enter name in the text box. But if I just click register user at this point, it's saying, hey, name is required. Enter name is not going to be a valid name. That's the initial value. So that's just a technique you can use with validation. So we went over several of the validation controls in this video. We showed you some of the techniques, began to build out how you could lay this out on the design surface. You're going to want to look deeper into validation on your own. Look at how the page is being checked in the code behind for being is valid, as well as look at some of the custom techniques that can use. And then keep in mind that you can always use regular expressions for validation as well.